Welcome everyone. Today we'll be building an open world gaming scene that is stylized similar to Genshin Impact. And what's really cool is we'll be building it from the ground up using Blender to make our 3D art and Unity to build our open world. So here you can see an open world scene in Genshin Impact, and what we're going to be focusing on are making grass that blends with the terrain, some fluffy stylized trees, and rocks to decorate our scene. This is a beginner-friendly tutorial, and what makes this tutorial a lot different from the other ones is we're not going to be using any pre-made assets. It's important that we learn how to make our own assets from the ground up so that we can project a unique style into our own games. For this tutorial, I will at times be using the Deco Pro Gen 2 XPPen to help stylize this result, which I've personally found to be really helpful. If there's any questions or comments, feel free to drop those down below, and let's go get world building. The very first thing is I want to show you a couple techniques you can use with the XPPen that can help us with a hand-painted look. Okay, so I'm just in an empty Photoshop file here and I have a brush. Oftentimes, we want to just create a brush stroke, and so we might just brush across the screen like this. And if you have a pressure-sensitive drawing pad like the XPPen, you can actually enable this pressure-dependent opacity at the top. Now, as I press harder and softer on the pad, we can dynamically change the opacity. Another use that is fairly obvious but really nice when you're hand drawing stuff, we get a lot more precision. So I might try to draw some text here with a normal mouse, and yeah, I'm absolutely terrible at this. But with the XPPen, I'm just naturally writing here. It feels really good and responsive, like I'm writing on a pad with a pen. One final quick trick I want to show is dynamically adjusting our brush size. To do this, enable the pressure-dependent brush size on the top right. Now let's just draw in some colors. Okay, so we get some nice even red brush stroke here, but what happens if I press harder with yellow? Well, it's about triple the size, so we have a huge range here. We can just press down harder and get a really nice stylized look for any edges that we might want to draw. And just to show you one more time, here I'm pressing down harder and harder as I draw this wavy blue line, and you can see it gets much thicker towards the end. It's a great product to have if you're a digital artist, and I will say this thing just plugged right into my computer like a mouse, and it was immediately ready to use, so I highly recommend the Deco Pro XPPen. Now, let's get started in our project. So here we are in an empty Unity project, and to get going, let's make a terrain in Unity. Create a terrain object in your scene, and I'm going to click on the terrain, go to the terrain settings, and change the size down to about 100 by 100, so it's a bit smaller for now. Okay, I'm going to drag our main camera over to the middle so that we have a nice view, and now we can get started shaping our terrain. Head into the terrain painting tab, make sure raise or lower terrain is selected, and we can grab a noisy brush. I'm going to make the brush size very large here, turn the opacity way down to something like 3, and let's just paint on some large terrain features. I always like to make the brush a little smaller after the first pass and paint in some smaller features, and then finally we can take the smoothing brush afterwards and just make the landscape look a little more natural by doing a single pass here. Okay, so our terrain is set. Now we need to make some grass and ground textures. So let's open up Photoshop. If you don't have Photoshop, don't worry, you don't need it. You can use something free like Krita or GIMP instead. Create a new file, and I'm gonna make a texture that's 1024 by 1024. We're gonna start by making our grass texture, so I'll make a new layer. Then for the background, I'm actually gonna change this to black for now so that you can see what I'm doing a little bit better. This texture will control the alpha channel of our grass, so we don't need any color at the moment, it'll just be black and white. I'm going to take the simplest possible approach here. You can literally just grab a pencil or something and draw in the outline of grass blades. You could also do this with like a lasso or something if you wanted, but what's great is we're going for this nice stylized scene, so having this level of manual control is great and actually very important. I'm just making some grass blade looking shapes. It's surprisingly unimportant what the small details look like exactly, but this is just more of a basic approach that I wanted to show. So I'm just resizing here. I want to get like maybe 5 or 6 blades in for this texture and just vary the heights and the widths and the shapes a little bit to get a nice result. Now a little trick here is I want to get the edges fading a bit in our scene. So I'm going to erase the edges, but let's just turn the opacity down so it doesn't erase everything. Just go along the edges a bit. Remember, this will be giving our blades of grass a bit of translucency and fading on the edges. So that's kind of the idea here. The final thing I'll do is a white to gray gradient on top of this texture. This will cause the grass to fade out a bit as it gets closer to the ground, making it blend better with our ground texture. Okay, it's really that easy. We're done here. Go ahead and hide the background layer, then we can save this into our Unity project. I'll make an art folder, then a textures folder, and name it GrassTex1. Okay, so I've switched into Blender now because I want to make a grass mesh. Instead of making a mesh with a lot of vertices that is really heavy on performance, we're going to use a technique known as imposters. Imposters are a compromise between performance and visual appearance, and in my opinion, one of the best ways to make high-performing grass. So how do we do this? Well, let me show you. First, make a plane in Blender, go ahead and rotate it by 90 degrees, and I'll move it up so the bottom of the plane is at 0 along the Z-axis. Use Shift D in object mode to duplicate the plane, then let's just move it out and away from our first plane. Give it a slight rotation, and it doesn't really matter too much which direction, but make sure you don't flip it all the way around. I'm going to keep doing this a few times, just try to create a random distribution of planes and rotations, and at some point you can just grab a bunch of the planes at a time and duplicate them, and just give them some kind of like Z-axis rotation. Keep doing this a few times until you have something like 15 to 20 planes. Remember, it's really important that you don't rotate more than a few degrees along the X or Y axis, otherwise your grass texture can get flipped. We can manually move and rotate a few at the end to get a more random distribution. Once you have something like this, you should be all ready to go. Go ahead and select all your planes, then use the command Ctrl-J to join all of them into a single mesh. The next part is extremely important, so right-click, set origin to 3D cursor, and then finally make sure you are in the object properties panels here. As you can see on the right, we have a non-zero rotation for our X, Y, and Z coordinates. We want to zero these out, so press Ctrl-A and apply rotation. Okay, great, so at this point we can export to FBX. Make sure your object is selected, check the mesh option, and check this apply transforms box. It's really important to make sure all those rotations are zeroed out and that we have this box checked here so the mesh exports correctly into Unity. The final thing I'm doing here is just setting the scale down a bit because I know that we're going to want the grass to be a bit smaller than the default here. Let's export into our Unity project. I'll make a folder named meshes and let's call this grass mesh. Alright, so let's get this set up in Unity now. We're going to be making a grass shader that blends with the terrain. So first make sure you install the shader graph package like I'm doing here. And then after that, let's just drag in our new grass mesh in front of our camera. So obviously it's just a bunch of planes right now, but the idea is to use our grass texture in a shader to turn this into some nice stylized grass. So I'm making a new folder named shaders, then we can go make a shader graph, make it URP and unlit for now. Double click the shader graph to pull up our shader window. Let's add in a new parameter of type texture 2D, name it main text, then just drag it on in. Drag the node and release to pop up this window, then select sample texture 2D. Now if we highlight main text, we can add in the default texture. So I'm just selecting the grass texture that we made earlier in Photoshop. We want to use this texture to control our mesh's alpha, but we don't have an alpha node, so we just need to go to graph settings here, select transparent, and then let's render both faces and check the alpha clipping box. Now we can just go ahead and connect the two alpha nodes. Next, add in a parameter named base color. We can drag this in, connect it to our fragment's base color, then I'll just kind of choose like a dark green for our base color here. And now let's go back into our project. So create a new materials folder, create a new material, name it grass matte. Then a little trick is we can drag our grass shader graph onto our grass matte to apply the shader. Finally, drag that grass matte onto our grass mesh to apply it. You can now see that our planes have turned into a nice little grass mesh. It looks like we lost our base color though, so just go into the shader and select some dark green color, and now our grass is looking pretty grassy. Okay, the next thing to do is to add the grass to our terrain. So select the terrain, then first go into the terrain settings. We're going to change from coverage mode to instance count mode. I tend to prefer this for the meshes approach, but this next part is super important. Before painting on any grass, turn detail density down to about 0.5 and your detail resolution per patch and detail resolution down to 64 each. If you forget this, you might crash Unity, so be careful. Next, go into Detail Painting tab. We're going to create a grass mesh prefab by unpacking our grass mesh. Then I'll just make a prefabs folder and drag this on in. And now we can add in a detail mesh to our terrain. So then drag in your grass mesh prefab, take any brush and just paint over the whole terrain. And it's not really going to look very good yet, but before we go any further, let's go ahead and add a ground texture. All right, so I'm back in Photoshop now. This is going to be very simple. Just grab two different shades of green, head up to filter, render, then render some clouds. To increase the contrast, we can add a brightness or contrast layer. up our contrast a bunch, and now we have just a nice simple grass texture for our ground. I'm going to save this in our project under the textures folder. I actually want to make a second texture real quick for a little variance. So I'm going to do the exact same thing right now, but just with like a light brown and maybe like a tannish color to represent more of like a light dirt or dead grass area. We do the same clouds technique and up the contrast. And if you want maybe a little more control, you can also try a different post-processing effect like vibrance and saturation for a little more control. Let's save this as our ground dirt and head back into Unity. Okay, so now we'll just select our terrain. Make sure you're under the Paint Texture tab, and let's add a terrain layer. Then we can just select our grassy ground texture. We can go into our terrain settings real quick and turn down the detail distance to 0 to get a view of our terrain texture. Right now, it looks like a little grid-like, but we can fix that by going to our paint terrain and changing the tiling settings. I'll set this to something like 25 by 21. Now things look a lot more natural, and we can get some variation in color from our clouds method. Overall, I like this texture, but let's add a bit of variation by adding our light dirt layer. After it's added, I'm going to just change the tiling settings to be a bit larger again, then choose a brush with a soft edge and low opacity. Now we can just paint on this new texture right on top of our grass texture, but obviously we got a pretty big problem. It would be nice if we could blend this grass with the ground texture to stylistically match something like Genshin Impact. We can do this by modifying our grass shader, but first we have to somehow capture our terrain's texture's color. To do this using shader graph, we can make a render texture using a camera. So create a new camera in the scene. I'll name it just terrain camera and carefully follow the next steps. First, zero out the transform position. We set the X rotation to 90 so that it's looking straight down at the terrain. Next, we set the Y position greater than our detail distance. I'll choose a value of 250 here. Also, make sure to set your camera projection to orthographic. And here is the key to getting this render texture to work. We need to set the size to half the size of our terrain, so I'll set it to 50. We also need to change the position for X and Z to be in the middle of the terrain, so we also set each of those to 50. Now you can see the terrain should appear right in the center of our camera. One more thing is we only want to render our terrain and no other features like trees or rocks, so let's set the terrain to its own layer by selecting our layers. We can just type in our new layer name and then make sure you switch the terrain objects layer to the terrain layer. To only render that layer, go to our camera settings, then switch the culling mask from everything to just terrain. Make sure the terrain is checked. Now under textures, we create a render texture to render our terrain. Then under camera settings, we drag in our render texture to the output texture. I'm also going to switch the size of the render texture to 1024 by 1024 to get enough detail. Alrighty, so now that we have our terrain texture, we can use it in our grass shader, so open that back on up. Start by creating a position node, split it, and get the first and third nodes, which represent the X and Z coordinates in our scene. We feed both of those into a vector2 node, then we send the output into a divide node. We need a parameter to divide by, which I'll name terrain size. So we drag in our terrain size, and what we're doing here is basically normalizing our position in world space by our terrain so that the max and min for each component of the vector is 1 and 0. We drag the output into an add node. In the other end, I'll put a float, but for now, let's just keep it at 0. Finally, we bring in our render texture as a texture 2D asset, connect it to a sample texture 2D node, and bring in our world space vector as our UVs for the texture. Now we need to select our terrain texture as the render texture, and at this point, we're done. I'll just make a little more space here, and I do find that at this point, a lit material works better. So in graph settings, change to lit. We're going to want to set our smoothness to 0, then connect our texture output to the emission property of our grass. Now our grass color should reflect the render texture color in the right world space coordinates. You can see the result of our shader. Things look actually really good, quite a bit better now I would say. But I do want to note that if you're using a .psd file, make sure that you come into the grass texture here and check the alpha is transparency and remove the PSD matte option so that we can affect the opacity of our grass. Right now, our base color is overriding our terrain color a bit, so go into your grass shader and I'll show you how to blend this a bit. Simply move the base color more towards the black for more of a blend. I honestly like it here if we just set it all the way to black. You do see there's a nice blending between our different ground textures, and the grass preserves that patchiness in our ground texture as well. Okay, so we're going to move on to trees now, so let's head back into Photoshop. We'll make a 1024 by 1024 texture. I'll add this black background for visibility, and I'm going to select a brush from our watercolor pack Adobe supplies on their website. You just gotta download this and double click the file to install, and brushes will just show up in Photoshop. If you don't have these, it's totally fine. Just grab a standard brush. The result will look very similar. All right, so now I'm selecting my brush, and one useful tip here is that you can use the command Alt right click, then drag to resize your brush. So I'll just be painting on some leaf-like patches. I'll select an opacity of 80% so our leaves are a bit transparent in some of the places. So as I'm drawing in here, I'm going for this hand-painted look, so even though things don't exactly look like leaves, that's totally fine. So that's all we really gotta do. Go ahead and hide the background and save this. I'll put it in our textures folder and name it Leaf Text 1. We also need a tree bark texture, so create a new texture, and this time we want a background to be kind of light and birchy color, so maybe just a little bit of an off-white background. Fill that background, and now we gotta paint on some dark gray jagged features. I like using the polygonal lasso for this. We can just create some random jagged edge shapes, preferably long and thin like you'd see on a birch tree. We don't need too many, but somewhere between 5 and 10 should work pretty well. When you're done, grab a light gray color and just fill in all these shapes. For a little more unique style, we can also just make a slightly larger outline around each of these shapes to give it a bit of depth. Again, use the polygonal lasso and just hand draw these things in. Once you're done, choose a lighter gray color and fill those in, and I'll reduce the opacity on this layer to something like 30. I also think it adds in a little bit of variation if we make some smaller, lighter features, so let's just draw those in again on a new layer, and you can even copy and paste these and do a little rotation quickly to get extra features. Go ahead and save that in our textures folder, and then let's head into Blender. Now that we have our leaf and bark textures, let's work on our 3D tree model. To make this as easy as possible, I highly recommend installing this add-on named Sapling Tree Gen, so just make sure that the box is checked there, and once you have that, you'll be able to go to Add Curve, choose Sapling Tree Gen to generate a new tree. So there's a few presets to choose from. I'll go with Japanese Maple, and we got ourselves a nice little tree here. It's a little too complex for the art style we're going for, so you can just reduce the branching under this custom shape panel by setting the second, third, and fourth boxes to 0. There's really a ton of customization settings here, but for now, let's just choose the branch splitting and reduce the branches and segments until we have something that looks really basic. Alright, so now we can select our tree in object mode and convert to mesh, and you can see that we have a nice mesh of quads. We need to add leaves, and unfortunately the sampling generator doesn't do a good job with low vertice count leaves, so we're going to do it custom instead. Go into weight paint mode, and I like to use this gradient tool. You can basically just drag in a radial direction around the tree and paint on a weight group, which will be used to fill out our leaves. So obviously get a higher density towards the top, and you can also paint in a bit of customization towards the lower parts for a bit of variation. Once you're happy with that, let's add a particle system for our leaves. So how can we just show these leaves though? Well, we can basically make an imposter again for better performance. So let's add in a new plane. And for this, we want to create this structure where we rotate a bunch of planes by 45 degrees in both the X and Y directions. So at the end, you'll have this kind of odd looking fluffy shape, but this will make our leaves visible from every viewing direction. Select all of those planes, use Ctrl J to join them, and let's add in a quick shader so that you can see what we're working with. I'll add in an image node and select our leaf texture. We only need the alpha channel here, so just drag that into the alpha of our material and make sure to select alpha clip for the blend mode. Now we have a little fluffy patch of leaves. Of course, we can change our base color to dark green or something for demonstrational purposes, but let's not go into too much detail here because we're going to be making a shader in Unity instead. At this point, select our tree again. Let's set the number of particles much lower and choose hair. Under the render tab, we choose render as object. Then we can use the selector tool and click on our leaves. Now you can see our leaves are applied to the tree, but they're just kind of randomly distributed. To fix this, go to the vertex groups dropdown and under density, choose group, which is our weight paint group. Obviously the scale is a bit small, so go back to the top and increase the scale until it looks more like a fluffy tree. I'm going to make a few adjustments, so I'll reduce the number of leaves and maybe increase the scale a bit more. Now you can see that one of our branches happens to have no leaves. If you want to fix this, you can just change the seed until you find one that looks a bit better. Cool, so I'm pretty happy with this. The leaves texture doesn't look great, but we'll fix that in Unity, don't worry. At this point, go into the modifier tab, and we're going to click Make Instances Real. Next, click Apply, and now we have a nice leaves mesh. We want to join all of these planes together, so the trick here is to shift-click one of the leaf planes, then join them together. The last thing to do here is modify the UVs of our tree trunk. Real quick, let's select the tree trunk and go into the Shading tab. I'll make a new material for our tree and add in our birch bark texture. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a problem. It looks like our texture is aligned along the wrong direction. This is because of the way the default UVs are set up. So let's actually go into the UV editing tab, enter edit mode, and select all. Under the image editor tab, you can see the direction of the bark texture is horizontal, but if I select faces along the vertical direction in our mesh, it's going horizontally across this texture. This basically just means that our UVs are misaligned by 90 degrees. My favorite solution for this is to just rotate all the UVs by 90 degrees. So select all, rotate by 90, and now if we look at our material, the texture is going in the correct direction. The scaling, of course, is a bit off, but that's something we can easily fix in Unity, so I'm just going to keep this for now. We're almost ready, but to ensure our leaf shader works properly, make sure you select these leaves, go into the Object Properties panel, and what we need to do is make sure to reset the position and the rotation of our leaves. So we can just do Control A and apply all transforms. All right, finally, we're ready for export, so I'm just going to export this into our meshes folder and name it Tree Mesh. Let's open our Unity project back up and make some shaders. First, create a tree leaves shader and open Shader Graph. Let's start by making it a lit material and allowing material override. Also change the surface type to transparent and blending mode to alpha. Let's also render both faces and ensure alpha clipping is checked. For our parameters, let's create a bottom color and a top color. Then add our main texture as main text and a height blend parameter. Then next, let's hook up our alpha clipping float in case we need to control that parameter. Drag the main texture into a sample texture 2D and hook up the alpha channel. For our main texture, we select our leaf texture from Photoshop. We also want to blend our bottom and top colors. So create a position node, split the Y component, and drag that into the input of a smooth step node. We'll also create an object node and split the Y component of the scale off. Then hook that up to a divide node. We can drag in our height blend so that we now can adjust how the colors fade. Hook up the output of the divide to our smooth step edge. Then we'll drag this output into a lerp node. Add the bottom and top colors as the two inputs into the lerp, and finally connect that lerp node to our emission property. Okay, we're finally done here, so save that. Let's create a leaves material in our materials folder, and we can drag the tree leaves shader onto it, and then drag our material onto the mesh's leaves material to apply it. Let's make sure to change our surface options to transparent, alpha, and render both faces. We can select a dark green color for the bottom color and maybe something like a light green for the top. I'll just play around with this height blend parameter a bit so that you can see its effect. Another thing that we can do is turn off receive shadows and add a base color to our shader. So I'll just do that real quick and hook it up to our base color. Definitely play around with all these colors and settings a bit. You can even mess with the alpha clipping to change how the edges of the leaves fade. The very last thing we need to do here is create a material for our bark. Right now it has the default material from Blender, but let's create a custom one in Unity. I'll name it Tree Trunk Map, apply it to our tree mesh, and we don't even need a shader for this one. So for the base map, select our birch texture, and we can just play around with these tiling values to change the scaling. So I like a bit lower on X and a bit higher on Y to get these like long, kind of thin appearances of these cuts in the bark. I think this looks pretty good. We can just re-enable the leaves and we finally have a nice fluffy tree. At this point, I'm going to finalize out our scene. I did some rocks offline. I don't think it's really worth showing because they are just some very basic meshes. I'm also going to bring in a skybox from the Unity Asset Store, so we won't be going over those either. Okay, so now I'm just dragging on a couple rocks, adding in our skybox in the lighting panel, and then I'm going to just go ahead and duplicate some of these trees, maybe even make like one new material with a few different colors, like a red to yellow fade. And with that, we've reached the end. Let's check out our final scene in play mode. I hope you all enjoyed the video today. We covered a ton of ground. Besides the skybox, we made everything in our scene from complete scratch, including grass, ground textures, custom shaders, rocks, and trees, and built a demo scene in Unity. If you have any questions or comments, drop those below, and I will see you in future videos. Peace!